Some women had to wait even longer still for the right to vote. To tell their story and her own, I welcome Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer to the stand.
You again. Me and Miss Witness Box have quite the history. Oh, pardon, her story.
The floor is yours, Mrs. Hamer.
In 1962, a civil rights group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we called them SNCC, came to my small town, Ruleville, Mississippi. They spoke on a Monday night at the William Chapel Church. They were there to teach us how to register to vote. Before that, the 15th Amendment of the Constitution gave the blacks the right to vote. But they put in so many loopholes and rules and made it almost impossible for a black to vote. So much so we were scared to do so. Wouldn't even open our doors for SNCC or the Martin Luther King Jr. Ministries. I was scared myself. But a friend asked me to go, and I'm glad I did. The leader of SNCC, James Foreman, told us that we could vote people out of office, hateful people. And you know, that made so much sense. So when they asked who wanted to go down on a Friday to try to register to vote, I held up my hand.
And what made you hold up your hand when so few others did?
Well, I had this saying, and I always said it. We is sick and tired of being sick and tired. My parents, Jim and Luella Townsend, were sharecroppers. The problem is we never made a profit. The sharecropper made sure of that. One year, my friend who could read and do math kept track of the numbers. She saw that she had made in profit $4,000, and the landowner said she only made $200. We barely had enough money to eat. I was sicker and sicker of the system. The last straw was in 1961. I had this little knot, and I went to the doctor to have it removed, a tumor. After the surgery, I found out they had given me a hysterectomy without my permission. They always did that to black women. 60% of black women in Sunflower County, Mississippi, where I was from, went into the hospital for one thing and came out robbed of having children. Why? I asked, why? They didn't give me no reason why, but I know why. My husband and I wanted to have children, but I was robbed of that. Couldn't get a lawyer. A black woman taking on a white doctor, they can do anything they want and get away with it, but we had no power. So when they asked who wanted to go down and become a registered voter, my hand was already twitching.
What happened when you went to register?
Well, me and 17 others got on a bus to Indianola. When we got there, we were told only 2 could go in. So me and Ernest Davis went in to take the literacy test. But before you could, you had to write down by whom you were employed. So by the time you got back home, you were fired from your job. The registrar came out with this big book that had a section of the state constitution that we had to interpret. The darker your skin, the harder the test. Whites passed, blacks did not. He read a portion of the Constitution on the de facto laws. We know as much about a de facto law as a horse knows about Christmas Day. I flunked, but I studied with the help of SNCC, and after 4 months, I went back to take that test, and I passed. After that, I was determined that I was going to help others register to vote. I knocked on doors. I held hand on the bus to Indianola. I even taught people how to read the Constitution. But the problem was, most people were too scared because they thought if they registered to vote, they would lose their job if they did. I did. Day one after I registered to vote, the landowner came and told me I had to leave that very night if I didn't take my name off the voter's registration book. I told him, I didn't go to register to vote for you. Mayor came out and said, anybody caught taking any voter registration classes will be given a one-way ticket out of town. And if that didn't do it, they did whatever they had available, and they did. My house was firebombed. They shot at me so many times, more than I can count. And then they sent us a $9,000 water bill, and we had no running water. And after this, what's the arrest?
And it was one of those harrowing arrests that affected you physically for the rest of your life and impacted the nation profoundly. Can you tell us about the 1964 Democratic Convention, Mrs. Hamer?
In 1962, I co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, a new Democratic Party, one to properly represent the people. In my county alone, after 2.5 years of work to get blacks to register to vote, 155 out of 13,524 blacks had registered to vote, compared to 7,000 white registered voters. Me, Bob Mosley, and Ella Baker started our own party. And we went to the Democratic Convention to unseat and challenge the all-white delegates of the regular Democratic Party. There was 435,000 blacks in Mississippi, and not one black delegate. Now, how is that representation? We traveled 1,200 miles to Atlantic City. I sang all the way there. And we made quite the fuss, legally so, that the Credentials Committee decided to give us a hearing. When we arrived, they put us in this little closed room with no cameras. We were like, The lawyer shamed the reporters, and they were allowed to come into our room. So the Credentials Committee offered to give us a hearing. August 22nd, 1964, 2:55 p.m., the hearing started. The first witness was Aaron Henry and Ed King. They spoke about the danger we faced trying to get blacks to register to vote, how the places we convened in were burned to the ground, and the fact that we lacked representation wasn't due to lack of desire, but self-preservation. By now, it was my turn. I told them how 18 of us got on the bus and drove 26 miles to Indianola, and only 2 of us was allowed to go in. And on our way back, the bus was stopped, and the bus driver got a ticket because the bus was the wrong color. I told him that the landowner told me I had to leave that very night if I didn't take my name off the voters' registration books. And how they shot 16 shots into my friend's house where I was staying. After a voter registration workshop, we stopped at this diner. We got off the bus to use the washroom and were kicked out. I jumped off the bus to see what was going on. We were all arrested. The details are gruesome, terribly horrific. But I had to live it all that day because the world needed to know how bad things were. I had a limp for the rest of my life. Lost sight in one eye. Had kidney damage that affected my health to my dying day. All this because we wanted to become first-class citizens. If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America? People were crying in the aisle, and so was I. It was hard to relive. But the country needed to know how bad it was. President Johnson knew that my words had power and that they could change people's minds, and he didn't want that. He even tried to stop us from getting to the convention in the first place. When I began my testimony, he called an emergency press conference, knowing that the news station would break away. But now, mind you, they didn't break away when Martin Luther King Jr. was giving his testimony. No, just mine. It was me that he feared. So they break away thinking that President Johnson was going to announce his pick for vice president. Instead, he announces that it was the 9th month anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. 9th month. Odd number, ain't it? And then he cut away. Yes, it backfired. Because he cut away, when people came home from work in the evening, the news station played my testimony over and over. And the whole country saw it, and the whole country was stunned.
Through all the setbacks and the violence, many would give up. Where did you find your strength?
My mama and God. Christ was a revolutionary person out there where it was happening. That's what God is all about. And that's where I get my strength. Christianity is not building a fancy church with people starving around the corner. It's about your fellow man. It's about the love, not hate. I don't hate. I can get angry. Yes, I can. My mama told me, hate or hating make you just as weak as those who hate you. And as a matter of fact, those who hate you are more scared than I was. As a matter of fact, they were scared to death.
Of what?
Change. Equality.
But isn't equality what we love most about our country?
On paper. But when it comes right down to it, they don't want change because that means that you would have to give up some of your power. And that's a hard thing to do.
Even after losing her fight for delegation seats, Mrs. Hamer inspired many with her testimony. The nation's outrage grew, and she became one essential spoke in the grand wheel, along with the marches of Selma to Montgomery, Dr. King, and John Lewis with the Freedom Riders, spinning towards one of history's major turning points.
August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. And that is when all women and men technically got the right to vote. 55 years ago.
Despite African American men being granted the right to vote by the 15th Amendment of 1870, many states imposed strict voting laws that disenfranchised all but a few Black citizens, effectively rendering the 15th Amendment useless. So when the 19th Amendment passed, granting women the right to vote, it failed to represent all women. Voting rights for Mabel Pingwa Lee and Miss Fannie Lou Hamer arrived by a much longer, muddier road. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the most sweeping civil rights bills ever passed. It did away with biased literacy tests and ridiculous rules, such as making potential Black voters recite the entire Constitution, something I'd like to see our current leaders try. They were no longer asked to interpret complex laws as if they were Harvard law students. The new law allowed federal investigation into states where less than 50% of a non-white population had not registered to vote, thus mitigating a culture of intimidation. That's not to say voter suppression didn't continue. It did. But citizens could now challenge illegal voting practices in court. In 1964, 6% of Black Mississippians were registered to vote. 5 years later, with the help of Mrs. Hamer, 59% were. But in 2013, the Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder resulted in the repeal of one of the Voting Rights Act's most crucial sections. Sections 4 and 5 mandated that certain states get approval or pre-clearance from the federal government before changing its election laws. In a 5-4 decision, it was decided that the law was no longer needed because our country has changed. Racism was over, so the law was obsolete. I dissent. Voting discrimination still exists, but the court today terminates the remedy that proved best suited to block that discrimination. The Voting Rights Act became one of the most consequential, efficacious, and amply justified exercises of legislative power in the nation's history. Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. As soon as the repeal went into effect, many of the restrictive voting laws that had disappeared when the VRA was ratified reappeared, such as ID laws, last-minute closures of polling stations, or the purging of voter rolls. The fight against disenfranchisement is far from over. The opening words of America's Constitution are perhaps my favorite. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. The original We the People excluded many. If you were African American, Indigenous, Hispanic, Asian, gay, transgender, a woman, you were not included in We the People. My mission in life was to expand who was included, so we could in fact work towards a more perfect union. We are not perfect, nor are we in union when equality falters. One of the first cases I won as a young lawyer was Reed v. Reed in 1971. Idaho state law said that the administrator of an estate had to be male. When the case went to the Supreme Court, I argued that biological differences between the sexes bear no relationship to the duties performed by an administrator. We won the case. This was the first time that the 14th Amendment, which requires equal protection under the law, was applied towards sex. Reed v. Reed set the precedent that no policy could discriminate against a woman on the basis of sex. If you are a woman who owns a house or has a credit card in your name, it was this case that opened that door. Prior to 1971, companies or state governments could deny women basic rights and luxuries simply because they thought women weren't capable of handling such responsibilities. I wrote this brief standing on the shoulders of women who came before me, like Polly Murray, the lawyer whose work laid the foundation for Reed v. Reed. And because of her work, I was able to create opportunities for women in the future. I can only hope that others stand on my shoulders in turn, and we one day see that more perfect union.
We have a long way to go. You know what the problem is? We are all so isolated. But each one of us have a unique light, and we have to let that light shine, but not snuff out the light of the women standing next to us, but shine those lights so they beams over everyone. Fan the flames so the fire blazes high. You raise one up, we all go up. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. All over my sisters, I'm gonna let it shine. All over my sisters, I'm gonna let it shine. All over my sisters, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Ruth, why don't you come get some rest now? You're gonna have to trust them to take it from here.
Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.